What's up, everyone? Today, I wanted to do another professional development kind of career chat where I talk about why I got into IT consulting and then why I ultimately left it. Go through my thought process, the things you experience, and just things you might not know about being an IT consultant and whether or not it will be the right fit for you. My name is Jeff. This is Jeff Brown Tech. Let's go ahead and get started. First off, I wanted to get into IT consulting because I wanted to make more money, and that was my entire thought process was consultants make more money. I was working a job at a state government agency where the almost 5 years I was there, I never received a raise. That's just not how it worked. You were limited by state budgets and everything like that. Really no opportunities to get a promotion. There was nowhere for me to go. So I became a little obsessed with trying to make more money. This is definitely early on in my career and probably something that a lot of young people early in their careers think about. I thought maybe I should get into IT consulting. Like I mentioned, that was my thought process was consultants make a lot of money. What I realized about being a consultant is you had to specialize in something, and that was also crossed my mind is I worked in a lot of different areas, but I didn't know a lot about one thing or maybe one or two things. People always talk about that T shape. You have something like this where you have broad knowledge, but then you have one area down where you have a lot of information and you're kind of an expert in. This was around 2012, 2013. And as I was looking through job applications and career descriptions and everything, two things stuck out to me. One of them primarily being VMware and Citrix. And then my other thought process was every company has email. And so maybe I should focus in on Exchange. I started learning VMware a little bit more, got a certification, but ultimately I came across a job opportunity where I'd be a full-time Exchange and Link server administrator. Link server eventually became Skype for Business server, which then was taken over by Microsoft Teams in the cloud. I worked that job for about 3 years and really gained a lot of expertise, I felt like, in Exchange and Link and Skype for Business. I went out and got the Microsoft certifications for those, and eventually came across a consultant position with a Microsoft partner working with Skype for Business. This was also early on in the days of Microsoft Teams. I don't even think Teams had voice capabilities and conferencing at that time. It was mainly, chat and channels and everything like that. If you've never been an IT consultant or work in a consulting agency like that, this is typically how your work comes in and is processed and how you are assigned to things. Essentially, a customer will come to the company, or in this case, since we were a Microsoft partner, Microsoft would recommend us to certain customers. Customer would talk with one of our salespeople to start talking about needs and wants and everything. They would be paired with a sales engineer who would get into the technical side of it of what they were trying to accomplish. And what they would do is come up with a statement of work or a SAL. This statement of work is very important because it outlines exactly the work that you're going to do for the customer. At that point, the customer signs off on it, timelines, budget, the number of people that'll be on the project. You probably have a project manager, one or two consultants, maybe an architect, all that fun stuff. They sign off onto it. Then that's where you come in, is you are assigned to this project. You then take a look at this statement of work and see what you need to do. At that point, you start engaging the customer, you start scheduling meetings. Sometimes you would fly out and meet with them in person and have 2 or 3 days worth of workshops to get all the information and talk about the solution, and then start working on it and hopefully implement it for them. In an ideal world, that's what would happen. However, in my experience, a lot of the times that is not exactly how it would go. For one thing, the statement of work might not encompass everything that you need to do with the project, or it's forgotten a few things. That's no offense to any sales engineers out there because they are technical people, but sometimes you start getting into the more weeds of it and realize it doesn't cover everything. Then what do you have to do? You have to implement a modified statement of work or an amendment or something like that, which might come with increased hours, which is more budget that the customer has to then go get approval for. Secondly, I always found the hours estimated for a project were way too much sometimes. This would often lead to, at the end of the project, there was a lot of hours left on the table that you ended up billing for, and then you didn't bring in as much money as we originally thought we would on the project. One of the other frustrations with this is you're working with a customer and you may not always get access to their environment the way you would normally like. I came from working in an internal IT at corporations and other organizations like that, where you have access to be able to go do what you need to do. That's not always true when you're working as a consultant, which can lead to a lot of frustrations in trying to get the work done. In one case, working with a customer, I needed VPN access into their environment because I was actually deploying physical devices. For this particular customer, I was going on site about once a month to help with a transition to a new technology. And when I was there, I would work on the devices because I had access. Otherwise, I wasn't able to do my work remotely, which led to a decrease in billable hours. So again, you're left at the mercy of the customer to be able to get things done. And sometimes they don't always get you the access, or they're not in a hurry about it to let you do the job that you need to do. Now, one thing I want to talk about is billable hours. I mentioned it just a second ago. The more billable hours that you bill to a customer is good for your company on the consultant side, because the consultant company doesn't need to then reach into their own pocket to pay you. They're billing the customer. The company takes their money for their profit, and then they pay you, the rate that you're getting paid. However, again, sometimes what I would run into is you would be working on a project and the billable hours, there just wasn't enough work to do. I always found that frustrating because when I worked with internal IT, if I was working on this and got stalled out, or I was waiting on somebody else, I could go work on this, I could go work on that. Sometimes you're working out of a ticket queue, and you can always find work to do, or you can just go research. When you're working as a consultant, it's a lot tougher. You're working on just one very specific thing for this customer. And if they stall out, or they're busy doing other things and they don't get you the information you need, you're just kind of left twiddling your thumbs a little bit. Again, not billing hours. Also had a situation once where I was learning a new technology. So I was being told, hey, as you're learning these things, bill the customer for it because it's for their project. However, the project ended up stalling out, but I was still billing. And eventually a customer came back and said, hey, why are we still seeing 30 or 40 hours being billed by so-and-so? The project's halted right now. So again, not to call out consultants or anything, but it felt a little slimy maybe. Not sure what the good word would be there, but I was billing while I was learning something, but I wasn't really doing any work for the customer, unfortunately. Another thing to think about with billable hours is the number of hours in a week. So let's pretend, we work a standard 40-hour week. Your billable or your utilization rate would be maybe 75, 76%, which is 32 hours a week. Now, I want you to think about your typical week. Yes, you're working a lot of hours, but maybe you're attending meetings, or there's training you have to go to, or anything like that. I always found it hard to meet that minimum. And then again, you look at it from a yearly perspective, 52 hours or 52 weeks, 40 hours a week, that's 2,080 hours. Let's just round it to 2,000 hours because you have to take vacation every now and then. And, 75% of that is about 1,500. Now, you might think that's easy to do, and for some people, maybe it is, but I always found it difficult to meet that minimum utility there. Another thing I just mentioned, you take time off. You get sick. You want to take 3 or 4 weeks of vacation. You're just digging yourself a hole there that you then have to, bill more for. Or maybe within internal to your company, they want to send you for a day or two of training or something like that. Again, another thing I'll get into. And that, again, cuts into your billable hours. So you're actually working more and more and more. Another thing I found it difficult to do is go to any type of training or furthering education. Because again, if you go do that, then you're not billing the customer, because your employer's paying for that out of pocket. And those are just hours you're not billing, which is the whole point of a consultant agency, is billable hours. When I worked at Microsoft, I was a premier field engineer, or PFE. I believe they're called customer engineers now. And I was a dedicated PFE, which means I had a handful of customers that I would work with and, help them with their projects, deal with any support requests with them, all that. What was different about them is they bought hours ahead of time that I then needed to use throughout the year. So let's go back to that 1,500 number. In order to get about 75% utilization there, I would be given, 1,600 hours across 3 or 4 customers that I would have to figure out how to use and build to them over the course of that year. Now, this could be done through weekly meetings, researching things for them. A lot of times we had to do workshops with them. Now, I'm not a salesperson, though. I could go to a customer and say, hey, there's this workshop. We could teach you these things and all that. And they'd be like, nah, we're good. And I'm like, okay. I had a hard time convincing customers to take these workshops. And if I could, that would be, a big chunk of those usage hours for the year. But there was even one time I had a customer, they agreed to do a 1-day workshop virtually. And then the day before, they're like, hey, wait a minute, why are we doing this? I don't think this is really needed for us, which was really frustrating because we went to them and said, do you want to do this? And they said, yeah, let's do it. So again, very frustrating. I always found it difficult to, get these hours in and everything, which if you're not doing those hours or there's no customers for you to work with at the time, then you get put on the bench. The bench means you're not billing hours. And if you're on the bench long enough in some places, you're just let go. And that may not necessarily be your fault because there's no work coming in. Going back to the training aspect a little bit, let's say you're working in an internal corporation right now, internal IT department. Maybe there's a Friday that comes around. It's a little bit slower. You're caught up on most things, or you're just needing some downtime. You can go watch a Pluralsight course, go watch a YouTube video, read some blogs, work on some scripting, or maybe you're learning a new language. And that's a good thing because you're upskilling in your current role to provide more value in the job that you're doing. I always found that a little harder to do working in consulting because I couldn't take that time during the day to go learn something new necessarily because it's not billable hours. Or I could go watch something that's maybe kind of adjacent or maybe just something I'm interested in. In previous roles, I don't work with Kubernetes, but it's something I'm learning and it could be of value eventually. But I can't bill for that if I was a consultant. Now, if I'm working at a corporation and we're looking at doing Kubernetes or something like that, doing that training is no big deal. Again, just going back through my experiences, I always found it hard to meet minimum billable requirements or utilization. I found it more constraining in the work I could do because you weren't always given access to customer environments or is very limited, or maybe you couldn't do it remotely. And then there was the training aspect, learning new things. I found that very difficult to do sometimes because I always felt like if I was doing that, then I wasn't billing customer time, which affected utilization, which affects bonus, or even putting on new projects and everything. I will say, however, the best consulting experience that I had was when I worked at Rackspace. When I interviewed there, I actually interviewed initially for a different position, but the manager there said, "Hey, why don't you come do Teams consulting for us? We don't have anybody on the team that does Teams consulting." They were doing a lot of identity and exchange migration type work. And I told him about my hesitation because I wanted to get out of consulting and trying to meet billable hours and all that stuff. And he said, "Look, the only time I care about utilization is when everyone's utilization is way too high. That means I need to hire new people." I was a little skeptical at the time, but he was telling the truth. And that was a great group to work with. And actually some of the best consulting work I did, because we were working with small, medium-sized businesses. I would go in and they would be like, "All right, you're a full Teams administrator, an tenant, or even a global administrator. Go create user accounts or do the license assignments. Just go do whatever you need to do." And I had the control to be able to go do it. And if I didn't have a customer or projects were wrapping up, I could easily go do other work. I had some managed services work sometimes to go work with some different customers. It was a really nice blend of working consulting and then still being able to feel like I could upskill and learn new things, or, and then working the projects I did, I had the access I needed to be able to actually get the work done. And one of the other things when I was at Microsoft is I couldn't actually work in those customer environments. It was just a lot of teaching and managing the client and helping them with their technologies. And what I realized is I really like the hands-on keyboard work. I like doing the work. I like solving problems. I like PowerShell scripting and writing code and coming up with automation. And I just wasn't doing that type of work in that role, which is why I eventually moved out of Microsoft at the time. Anyway, for me, what I eventually figured out is I need the flexibility to work on many different things inside an organization. If one thing stalls out here because, we need a network change in the firewall to go do this, I'm like, great, I can then go do this. I have the freedom to go do that. Instead of being limited by statements of work or limited customer access or even work coming in through the sales pipeline. Now, there are some people that like consulting. They like the different work, maybe do a much better job than what I did in managing billable hours and everything. That's cool. If you're considering doing it, you can go try it, see if it works out for you. Again, it didn't work out for me. I didn't like it, which is eventually why I moved on and back into internal IT. Now, maybe someday I'll be an independent consultant to where if I'm working with a customer and they stall out for a little bit or they have to take a break because they have different priorities, then that's no big deal to me. I'll go do something else. It's always been an interest of mine of being an independent contractor, an independent consultant. Not to say I'm against consulting work, but I would just like the flexibility to do it under my own terms a little bit more than working with a consultant company. Anyway, I hope you found this useful. Again, this is not something I normally do, but if you like these types of talks I talk about where going through my career or anything like that, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment below. If you ever worked in IT consulting or internal IT, comparing and contrasting those, I just think it'd be a really good conversation to have. Anyway, hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.